I'm Mario Cordero, Chief Executive Officer of the Port of Long Beach. I'd like to welcome you to another episode of Port Update. My guest today is Dr. Geraldine Knatz, a noted maritime expert, a professor of the practice of policy and engineering at the University of Southern California, and an author of books including Port of Los Angeles, Conflict and Commerce, and The Fight for Control, published in 2019. She's also an alumna of Port of Long Beach and the Port of Los Angeles. Geraldine was Executive Director at the Port of Los Angeles from 2006 to 2014, with her service there beginning at the outset of the San Pedro Bay Port's Clean Action Plan, a joint effort between the two neighboring ports of Long Beach and Los Angeles to reduce the environmental impacts of operations. She moved to the top post at the Los Angeles port after her work as Managing Director of the Port of Long Beach, where she played a key role in the implementation of the Green Port policy back in 2005. She is a graduate of Rutgers University, a Bachelor's of Science in Zoology, and the University of Southern California, where she holds a Master's of Science in Environmental Engineering and a doctorate in Biological Sciences. Welcome, Geraldine.
Thank you, Mary. It's great to be here.
Well, it's a pleasure to have this interview with you. As I indicated, you are an alumni of the Port of Long Beach, and after you left the port, you went on to greater things, so to speak, as being the ED, or the Executive Director of Port of LA. So here we are 20 years later, and we're celebrating the 20th year of that Green Port policy that was implemented back in January 2005. So what are your observations with regard to where we were then and where we are now?
So Mario, well, first of all, thank you for inviting me and reminding me it's been 20 years since we adopted the Green Port policy. And I have to say it's incredibly rewarding to see how far the Port of Long Beach has come from those days, because back then, well, you know, I mean, sustainability was like talked about, but nobody was really implementing a whole lot. And so the things that the port did back then with the Green Port policy really formed a good foundation, and I think you're building on that today. So it's been fabulous, you know, to watch everything that's happened.
Well, let's go back in time to that 20 years ago. Give us a more perspective. At the time, I was a commissioner, but the day-to-day observation from your part in terms of when the staff decided to undertake this endeavor of laying out the map of a Green Port policy. What was it like back then?
Well, I have to say it was a pretty difficult time because, you know, the state of California had basically declared that, you know, diesel particulates from truck exhaust were carcinogenic. When we had public hearings, we'd have AQMD staff, we'd had PhD, you know, doctors from the universities coming down and, you know, kind of complaining about, you know, the impact we were causing on health risk. And I think for a lot of us, it was like, oh, health risk, we have to assess health risk. That was kind of a new thing. And I kind of remember too, we, at the Port of Long Beach, we were doing the Pier J expansion project. And I remember there was kind of a misstep with that when it was appealed, like all projects were appealed to City Council, and we learned, oops, there's an error in the air quality calculations, and we had to rescind that. And then the momentous thing that happened was at a subsequent board meeting, you said, we ought to have a Green Port policy. And I can remember that distinctly. And so that was really the start of it. I remember going home that weekend and thinking, I could write something up on this. And I spent the weekend kind of, you know, mapping out some things, and remember coming into the office and saying, I think I have something we can present to the board. And I didn't really share it with anybody until it went to the board that day, and you were pleased, and I was happy to have delivered something that, you know, you put that mission out there, and the staff and I delivered.
Well, it's interesting because I think what people don't realize, comparing the staff that we have now in terms of the resources and the number of people compared to what we had then, it was limited. So I mean, that was a great job that you led given the resources and the staff that we had at the time. And after the Green Port policy, of course, we moved forward to continue to expand the environmental planning component of the operation. So with that, you know, you really have a unique perspective of having been a part of many years at the Port of Long Beach. And then you moved to be the executive director at the Port of Los Angeles. And now let's go back to that year, 2005. And then, of course, what came after that, the 2006 Clean Air Action Plan. I think the success of that collaborative effort was due to the fact that you were local. In other words, you knew the issues, you were from the complex, and the unique career track that you went from Long Beach to Los Angeles, and now you're working with your former boss, Dick Stanke, to that collaborative effort. Could you dwell into that in terms of what led to the 2006 Clean Air Action Plan?
Yeah, so, and you're right, collaboration was really one of the drivers that Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa had told me after I was hired, that one of the reasons he selected me for the position was because of my relationships at Long Beach. Because he wanted to, grow the port, but he also knew that it needed greening. So, collaboration again was that big driver. In 2005, before I left Long Beach, as I said, the environmental groups were asking for health risk assessments. We at Long Beach were watching what was going on in LA. And there had been a plan underway called No Net Increase. It was a Mayor Hahn initiative. And, I don't, was not really moving that much. And I think from the community perspective, no net increase means everything's going to stay the way it is. And really, we really want to clean up the environment and deal with some of the health risk issues. So at Long Beach, we ran that first health risk assessment, and I remember seeing the results. And I was like, whoa, the trucks are really driving these numbers, these additional cancer exposure. So then I wound up, actually I found out later that when I interviewed for the job at LA, I happened to mention, oh yeah, we have to get rid of these dirty old trucks. Mm-hmm. And then David Freeman, who was the board president, said, as soon as you said that, I knew you were the person we wanted. And so, went over there and actually had an initial meeting with Barry Wallerstein, who headed AQMD. Right. And he said in that meeting, we need a plan, And so, yeah, we do need a plan. So we started about that. And then, of course, I then used my contacts back at Long Beach to reach out and, talk about this. And, politically at that time, then you had Bob Foster running for mayor. And, in those days, it was very good in your political campaign to beat up on the ports because we were like the dirty ports at that time. We weren't doing enough, in the eyes of a lot of the community members. So you called me. I remember you called me and said, so what is it? Tell me about this, what, you're trying to do. And so that, again, I really, if you hadn't been here, Mario, who knows where we'd be. But the collaboration between your time at the Port of Long Beach and, and what was going on in LA, I mean, that got us to where we were today.
Well, thank you, Geraldine. I mean, I just threw out ideas, but at the end of the day, you and a lot of the people at both ports, the staff level, did tremendous work that's now looked at as a model. I'm talking about the 2006 Clean Air Action Plan, which led to the 2017 update. Yeah, so let's now comment on what we have today. Here we are in March of 2025, 20 years of leading green and 20 years of the Green Port policy, 19 years of the 2006 Clean Air Action Plan. And it's sort of now in a similar environment, an advocacy that really wants to maximize results in terms of air quality and the collaborative effort between the two ports and the regulatory agencies to address this. So give us your take now in terms of your observation of that collaboration.
So I can look back now and see that, conditions were optimum for the EPA, the AQMD, the two ports to come together. And, honestly, our customer base were a little leery about what we were doing. They were not too happy. They felt we were a little like, those people are maybe crazy. What are they trying to do, especially with the clean truck program? But, and I would tease people that, yeah, we spent, a short period of time working on the plan and then a long period of time figuring out how we were going to get all the agency logos on the cover of the plan. We used to joke about that. But, but it worked. I think today, the challenges are a little bit different. We thought it was like we were doing like something almost impossible. But back then in 2007, we were exchanging dirty diesel trucks for clean diesel trucks, and you could go buy them. They were expensive compared to buying a used old dirty truck, but it was a doable thing. Now, with the issue of going zero emissions, it's much more challenging. I suppose you could say we picked all the low-hanging fruit from the tree, and maybe we got the fruit in the middle, but now there's some things on the top that are really hard. And so I think it's going to take continued collaboration between the two ports to do that, because as a united force, you're more powerful together.
So let me, if I can, ask a part B to that question, because we're addressing the environmental collaboration that we've had over the years with tremendous success, particularly when you were at the helm there at the Port of LA, and Dick Stanky being at Port of Long Beach, undertaking, as you've mentioned, a tremendous challenge. I mean, we literally had black smoke from the tailpipes, black smoke from the smokestacks, and many people didn't believe we could achieve the results that we now look back and achieved. So in that, if I may, let's focus, or let's comment on the commercial component. As a former executive director of Port of LA, you want to comment in terms of how you see the commercial partnership and the competitive edge of these two ports today?
Well, I would say that, it was always, most of my time as executive director was during the economic downturn, So I had like one good year and then things really started going south. So, the two ports were extremely competitive. I mean, it was almost a ruthless competition during the economic downturn. Yet the staff, the executives, they rose above that to really focus on what had to be done. We all were trying to help our customers. And I'm sure you're still trying to help your customers and provide what they need in the way of facilities. I think automation is a big part of that question. And actually, I've been doing some research on automation. It's a controversial issue. It's part of the agenda of ways that your customers can get to that zero emission, that green terminal, but it's got a lot of controversy associated with it. So again, we didn't have as many of those struggles back then, but I think, it's become a little bit more complex, I would say.
So now you're in academia.
Yeah.
You're at your alumni, USC. So let's talk about how, from an academic observation today in your research at USC, looking at the governance, the environmental components, today's technology, and what that means in terms of where the seaports are going to globally around the world. Could you comment a little bit in terms of what your research has, for you, highlighted in terms of what that future looks like?
Yeah, when I first got to academia, I actually did a lot of research on port cooperation. I was really interested in looking at what is pulling ports together, what's driving them to collaborate, and why do some ports merge and others, like LA and Long Beach, actually even when I was port director, that issue came up again. Why aren't the two ports merged? And you look at what has propelled ports to really cement their collaboration. Like look at Antwerp and Zeebrugge. Here you have now those two ports. It's only been 2 years ago since they merged. They did that because, of course, they're now a huge volume of port. It was probably one of the largest port mergers in terms of volume there. But they also had a joint vision. We're going to be the hydrogen hub for the European ports, you know, and they felt that they could do that better than doing it separately. And so, and it takes the, you know, I even looked at the Seattle and Tacoma situation, you know, when they merged their two cargo operations. Here you had ports that were, you know, Tacoma had, you know, lower cost land. Seattle was right on the very expensive Seattle waterfront. You know, they had some, there were some economic reasons that made that viable. It was a look towards the future as to what the property in Seattle might be used for ultimately, and then you've got, you know, sort of more property in Tacoma. But it was also the fact that together they were stronger. And at that time, you know, you had the change in the ocean carriers, the big alliances, which were extremely powerful, and they could whipsaw the ports, you know, back and forth. And so that was a strategic decision to collaborate to grow their market power. Because when I first started in the port business, when I was still a student, I mean, ports had a lot of market power. You'd have customers coming at you, I want this, I want that, you know, give me a space. And, you know, over time as the, you know, that dynamic shifted. The market power shifted to the carrier alliances, and the ports were, you know, and that was really the driver for Seattle and Tacoma to merge cargo operations. So it really depends on the context of the individual port situation, you know, and when I looked at LA, I actually published a paper, you know, port mergers, why not Los Angeles and Long Beach? But if you look at what caused those other ports to merge, you know, all of the efforts at LA Long Beach were like somebody from the outside saying, you should do this. But where there were successful port collaborations were when the two port directors recognized it's in our best interest to do that. So it came from within the port organizations. It wasn't something politically imposed from the outside. And that's a key difference in you know, kind of viewing successful and unsuccessful port collaborations.
Well, during this period of time you mentioned when that topic came up, and I remember you're referring to the 2020 commission report. I was chairman at the FMC in Washington, so I observed from the outside, or from the East Coast, so to speak. But be that what it may, clearly merger is not going to happen here in Southern California, which is why in 2019, Port of Long Beach initiated a MOU with the Port of Los Angeles, a memorandum of understanding regarding collaboration as to the commercial component. So I think that has been a key in terms of maximizing that collaboration. And I think that's the step that I think, again, we need to continue to focus on because, again, it is a competitive arena today. You mentioned the carriers. You know, the alliance structure today is another factor that much different than what it was in that period that you described. So suffice to say, I think, again, I know for the Port of Long Beach, we've been talking about maximizing that collaboration, not only with the Port of Los Angeles, but, you know, we have a number of MOUs, sister ports on the environmental perspective, and which takes me back now to the environmental area before I ask my last question. But could you comment a little bit, talking about 20 years of leading green, and here we are with these MOUs and partnerships. When I say we, Port of Los Angeles, Port of Long Beach, and Shanghai, and Singapore on a green corridor. And the vessel orders that the carriers now have in line, which, you know, most of them are transitory fuel and a quest towards no net emissions per the IMC, or per the IMO, which they came to a meeting of the minds that on or about 2050, we will achieve that no net zero. So can you comment about how that collaboration on the global arena has really helped move the agenda on the environmental perspective?
Yes, I was really excited to see the Shanghai, Port of LA, Port of Long Beach collaboration. And yeah, you know, for years we had sister ports and these types of agreements, but a lot of times they were, kind of photo ops when, someone would take a trade mission like 20 years ago, and they do. But the agreements now have substance to them, and you're actually implementing something, working with the commercial side as well. So it's not just port to port, it's also involves, because the carriers have to, they're the ones that are going to travel that corridor. They've got to be part of that. And so I think we'll get there. I think it's going to be challenging. I think the issue of fuels, getting all of the fuels that we need to have here for the industry, both the local, industry, whether that's hydrogen fuel or methanol or all of these different types of fuels that are be looking at. That's a significant thing that has to happen. And even the charging, you've put in charging stations for the heavy duty trucks. There needs to be a lot more of that. And so, but you're on a pathway to get there. And so it's very exciting to see that all happen.
Well, I think, yeah, we're on a very positive track, not only with regard to our environmental policies, but in fairness, the San Pedro Bay complex. I mean, together, the two ports moved 20 million TEUs in 2024. And, right now, starting the year, it was nice to say in January that the Port of Long Beach was the #1 container port, but I think that probably will change with some of the February numbers, because traditionally, LA has that title because they have a little bit more berth space. But together, I think we have produced some great numbers. So you mentioned in terms of where you were in your career during the global recession, 2008, 2009, and before that, the dynamic of the embryonic stages of the hardcore environmental advocacy that we saw in 2004. You mentioned the city council meeting. You were referring to Pier J. And I remember that meeting. It was September of 2004.
Oh, you remember the exact date. Yeah. That's good.
And then after that, everybody thought about, let's talk about this idea about a green port. And here we are now in 2025, and that's our brand.
Yeah.
And but so my last question is this: as executive director of Port of Long Beach, you have been through a few challenges, and I'm talking about external. Whether it's geopolitical, other challenges that as an executive director or CEO you confront. How do you see the world today from a port perspective with regard to what we're seeing in terms of the geopolitical discussions that may or may not impact ports?
Well, I have to say in today's kind of U.S. political climate, it's safer to be at a port than it is at a university. So, but I have to say I am worried. And, there's been a lot of focus about the tariffs, and, reciprocal tariffs. I mean, sometimes it's like, what's the point? But, one of the things that really worries me is what's happening to NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and the National Weather Service. Because part of NOAA is National Ocean Services, and that's all of the services provided to the maritime industry. So if you're in shipping, you rely on NOAA data. Your pilots, have their, I assume they still have pilot mates, they use that real-time data. And so I would think that's another thing to kind of be concerned about, in addition to, of course, the tariffs, they'll affect volume. That happens. And then if we go into a recession, people will stop buying household goods. So, and that's, so as a port director, you're always worried about your volume. You want to see your volume going up because you want to make budget. You want to keep providing all of the things that you do for the staff, for the community, for your customers, So I worry about, sort of, I would see the impacts might be related to the NOAA things and whether, in some ways, ports have been sort of nonpartisan. I think both sides of the aisle support infrastructure for ports. I think they understand that, how critical it is to the U.S. economy. So fingers crossed that, the money that comes for infrastructure is still out there. There may be less, coming through EPA for, diesel reduction programs and things like that. But, as I say to a lot of people, this too shall pass.
Well, I mean, that's a great point because, again, I think you being also a historian, you know that the history tells you that, the ports are always going to weather the storm. The ports are essential for America. They're essential for our economy. So, like I said, whatever those issues we're confronted with, at the end of the day, we will be survivors.
Right.
Which will bring me to that last question. Let's go back to the book that was published in 2019, and that's why I referenced you are a historian.
Oh, yeah.
So what are the key points that, as an author, that you were trying to convey in writing that book?
And the last chapter of the book is kind of like a look back at that, 20th century, governance of the port, where I focused on what were sort of the big takeaways of that. And a lot of it had to do with change in governance and how that governance changed over time. And really the fact that, the port in its location was successful despite some of the things that happened along the way. And one of the things that when I worked there as port director, I hated the fact that every darn agreement had to go to city council. It was like a competitive disadvantage against Long Beach, because you guys could go to, your board would approve something to be done. And then I'd have to tell a customer, yeah, our board will approve it, but then it's going to take 3 more months to get through city council. And I used to hate that policy. But when I went back and studied the history of the port, I can see where that check and balance in Los Angeles was really important because of some of the things that historically, the port was trying to do. And there were, times that the city chief administrative officer said, I think there's something wrong with this deal. And once you know it, there was. So I learned to live with that governance structure in LA, which is different than Long Beach, and make it work, for us. But, I understand why certain things are put in place in LA. So.
Well, Dr. Knatz, Geraldine, thank you again for taking the time for this appearance on Port Update. And it's always a pleasure to talk to you because not only have you been in the industry for many, many years, now in academia, you continue to study the industry, you do research, and you go around the globe with regard to all these very important challenges and factors that come before the global ports and the nation's ports. So again, thank you so much. And thank you for your writings. I mean, I would encourage the public to read you've written 2 books on the port complex.
Yeah.
So with that, again, thank you for being here. And that concludes another Port Update here at the Port of Long Beach. Thank you.